Okay, let me start with a few comments about the series of 4 lectures. As many of you know, over the last decade or so, a number of people have been claiming that the methods of the cognitive sciences can contribute to making progress on traditional debates in moral theory. And what I want to do in these lectures is to support this claim, or at least try, by offering 4 case studies illustrating the way in which traditional debates can be transformed or remolded or advanced by theories and findings in the cognitive sciences. Well, one of the many ways in which the kind of work I'm going to be talking about differs from traditional work in philosophy is that it's resolutely collaborative. So before I start, I want to acknowledge at least a small number of the friends and colleagues who have contributed in major ways to the research that I'm going to be reporting. So here's the Rogues Gallery. And many of you will know Jesse Prince because he's often in Paris, but you probably won't recognize him. I guess you can't quite tell with this projector. But that's Jesse with his red hair. Here's Jesse with his blue hair, in case that makes him more recognizable. All right, so the first talk is called The Definition of Morality. And I want to start by taking you back 50 years and giving you some philosophical background. So 50 years ago, Alasdair MacIntyre published an article called What Morality Is Not. And in the very first sentence, he said, "The central task to which contemporary moral philosophers have addressed themselves is that of listing the distinctive characteristics of moral utterances." Well, jumping ahead to 1970, MacIntyre's article was reprinted in a very valuable volume called The Definition of Morality, which also reprinted a dozen other articles by leading figures like these folks, amongst the leading philosophers of their day. And all of those 13 articles, in one way or another, discuss the question, how is morality best defined? Well, as one might expect in a volume that had this distinguished list of contributors, the arguments were careful and sophisticated. And as one might expect in just about any group of 13 philosophers, no consensus was reached. Well, in that volume, in addition to debating how the notion of moral utterance, moral rule, moral norm are to be defined, many of the contributors to the volume also addressed the metaphilosophical questions. What is a definition of morality supposed to do? What counts as getting such a definition right? And there again, not surprisingly, no consensus was reached. Well, by 1978, the debate was still going strong. In that year, the American philosopher Paul Taylor published a paper in Midwest Studies where his explicit goal was to elaborate and defend an account of what it is for a moral norm to be a norm for a group of people. For our purposes in this talk, Taylor's article is particularly useful because it includes some very clear and very helpful discussion of the metaphilosophical questions. What, Taylor asks, what are philosophers trying to do when they offer a definition of morality and moral rule? And he points out different philosophers are clearly trying to do different things. Here are some of the options he distinguishes. Linguistic analysis, in preparing these slides, by the way, the Anglo-centric nature of this literature was painfully obvious. So one of the projects is to capture how the word moral or the phrase moral rule is used by English speakers or maybe by some particular group of English speakers. Another related but importantly different project is conceptual analysis, making the concept of morality or moral rule explicit, the concept that's held by most people, everyone in our society. Third option that is distinguished by Taylor is specifying the essence of morality. Those who pursue that particular project believe that moral rules and norms constitute a natural kind, all of the members of which share some essential property, or more likely, most of some cluster of essential properties. Okay? And for those working in that tradition, the goal of the project is to discover what the essential properties are. Now, Taylor himself makes it clear he thinks this is a fool's project, since he thinks morality has no essence, but of course he recognizes many others disagree. Well, the debate certainly didn't stop with Taylor's article. As recently as 2005, Bernie Gert published a long and feisty article in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy called The Definition of Morality. And even more recently still, Richard Joyce, in an excellent and important book, The Evolution of Morality, takes up the issue. Why? Well, Joyce is interested in providing us with an account of how the capacity for making moral judgments evolved. And as he points out perfectly cogently and clear-headedly, you can't even take on that evolutionary project without having an account of what it is you're talking about, what counts as a moral judgment, what is that capacity. So Joyce devotes a long and complex chapter to just that question, what is it to be a moral judgment or a moral rule? Well, let me now put psychology on the scene. So I've just given you a very quick sketch of 50 or more years of philosophical history. While all of this was going on, a group of developmental psychologists who had read and clearly been influenced by some of the philosophical literature began advancing a definition of morality of their own. On one reading, and I stress this is only one reading of this literature, but it's certainly the reading that I think has been most influential, and I'll come back to that. But on one reading, what these psychologists were claiming is that Taylor was wrong. Morality is, in fact, a natural kind, and moreover, they had discovered what the essential properties of moral rules are. Well, for about 2 decades, that empirical work was largely unknown to philosophers. But in the last, well, I say few years there, in the last perhaps decade or a bit less, this work has become increasingly influential in the work of empirically oriented moral philosophers and in the work of psychologists from outside that tradition, including a number of books I recommend to you. That one you can't see very well. That's Sean Nichols' book, Sentimental Rules. This is the Richard Joyce book I just mentioned. And that's the book by Blair and others, Psychologist on Psychopathy. All right, so much for the history and how psychology gets on the scene. Let me now give you an overview of some of the relevant psychology. Crucial figure in this tradition is Elliot Turiel, who put forward the theory I'm going to sketch for you and is the mentor of many of the other people in the area. In the 1970s, he proposed a definition of moral rule. He also proposed a definition of conventional rule, which is another notion that philosophers, particularly around that time, folks like David Lewis in his book Convention, had been lavishing a fair amount of attention on. But interestingly, Turiel didn't defend his definitions using abstract philosophical arguments, nor did he make any claims about how the words moral and conventional are used in English or any other language. Rather, what he did was he used his definitions to design a set of psychological experiments, and those experiments over the years have had some very extraordinary results. Well, let me first give you the core ideas of Turiel's definitions, the definitions that he and his followers have offered. First idea, moral rules are held to have an objective, prescriptive force. They don't depend on authority of any individual or institution, according to Turiel. Secondly, moral rules are spatially and temporally general. If they apply here and now, they also apply elsewhere and elsewhen. Third, moral rules are the kinds of rules whose violation typically has a victim who's been harmed, whose rights have been violated or who has been the victim of an injustice. And throughout this talk, by the way, I should mention it now, I'm going to be focusing on harm because although the official position is harm, rights, or justice, in fact, the overwhelming majority, in fact, perhaps maybe even all of the studies have focused on harm when they're looking at this claim. And finally, violations of moral rules are typically more serious than violations of conventional rules. Well, the core idea of Turiel and his followers' definition of conventional rules are, in a certain sense, predictable from what I've just said. They're just the opposite. Conventional rules are arbitrary, situation dependent. They don't have an objective prescriptive force. They can be suspended or changed by an appropriate authority. They are often geographically and temporally local. They may apply in one culture or in one setting, but not another. They do not involve a victim who has been harmed, whose rights have been violated, or has been subject to an injustice. And typically, at least, they are less serious than violations of moral rules. Well, guided by those definitions, Turiel and his associates developed an experimental paradigm that has become known as the moral conventional task. And this has been one of the most influential experimental paradigms in the moral psychology literature. So what happens in a moral conventional task experiment? The participants in the experiment are presented with examples of transgressions of prototypical moral rules and prototypical conventional rules, and then they're asked a series of probe questions designed to determine whether they think the action described in this vignette, this story, is wrong, and if so, how serious the wrong is. Whether the participants think that the wrongness of the transgression is authority dependent or not. So, for example, a participant who has said that a specific rule-violating act is wrong might be asked, well, what if the teacher, so this would be in a school context, obviously, what if the teacher said there is no rule in this school about that sort of act? Would it be right then? This is one of the many ways in which you can probe authority dependence or independence. Third, the participants are asked whether they think the rule is general in scope. Is it applicable in other countries at other times? And finally, they're asked how they would justify their moral judgment. What the experimenters are looking for is, do they appeal to harm, justice, or rights, on the one hand, or to something else? And the answers to these questions are what have been called in the literature, and I'll use this term from time to time, criterion judgments. Well, the early results in this experimental paradigm were truly impressive. They strongly suggested that the definition that Turiel and his associates had put forward was psychologically important. When asked about a prototypical moral transgression, for example, one child hitting another unprovoked, one child pushing another off a swing in a school, and about prototypical conventional transgressions, like a child talking in class when he hasn't been called upon by the teacher, or a boy wearing a dress to school, participants differed systematically, and they differed in just, so the answers they gave about these were systematically different to the answers they gave about these, and it seemed in just the way that Turiel's definitions suggested. In particular, transgressions of prototypical moral rules, as I say, almost all of which involved a clear harm, like pushing a kid off a swing, were said to be wrong and more serious than conventional transgressions, not authority dependent, general in scope, and they were justified by appeal to harm. Transgressions of the prototypical conventional rules were wrong but less serious, authority dependent, not general in scope, and they weren't justified by appeal to harm. Well, during the last 30 years, there have been, I've lost count last time I looked, something like 80 published papers. Maybe by now it's over 100. And these papers have found that pattern of results in an impressively diverse range of participants. Participants of different ages, for example, ranging from a little bit controversial as to whether you can get it at 3.5 years, but certainly it's there by 4.5 or 5 years, all the way up through adults, okay? But also participants of different nationalities and cultures, including all of those. I find that this is easier to take in that way. So those are amongst the field sites where this experiment has been tried. And participants of very different religions, including all of these. And I guess I had trouble finding a picture of Dutch Reformed children. It's not clear that they look like anything special. Well, what conclusions are we to draw from these results? The answer here is a little bit difficult because Turiel and his followers are heavily influenced by the work of Piaget and Kohlberg, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'll say it anyhow. And in my view, Piaget and Kohlberg are partial to a rather obscure terminology and to some philosophically tendentious concepts, and some of those are picked up and indeed added to in the Turiel tradition. So rather than trying to get involved, I'd be happy to do this in discussion or during the month I'll be in Paris, be happy to get involved in textual exegesis because I think the account I'm giving may indeed be the most generous account of what Turiel has in mind, but I'm not going to claim that because that's a hard case to make given how difficult much of the text is. Rather, what I want to do is offer some conclusions which, first of all, are plausible to draw from these findings, and secondly, which unquestionably most of the philosophers, most of the moral theorists who have been impressed by the moral conventional task, who have used and cited the moral conventional task, do in fact apparently accept. All right, so I'm going to offer you two sets of conclusions. Apologies for the numbering system. I couldn't think of a better way to do this. But the first set of conclusions, in effect, generalize the results. They say the results are specific instances of more general patterns. The second conclusion is a conclusion that maintains that those generalizations support an important claim about the nature or the definition of morality. So let me start first with the generalizing ones, and I think there are three of these. First of all, what I will call the clustering of criterion judgments. So the idea here is, just as we found in the experiments I pointed out to you, that in moral conventional tasks you get clustered answers, the claim here is that there are really only two what I'll call signature response patterns that people in moral conventional tasks, typically at least, or overwhelmingly, give you one of two signature response patterns. The signature moral pattern is the pattern where rules are judged to be, not surprisingly, authority independent, general in scope, serious, and justified by appeal to harm. The signature conventional pattern is the pattern where the rules are authority dependent, not general in scope, transgressions are less serious, and they are not justified by appeal to harm. So you've got two signature patterns. And furthermore, these signature patterns are what philosophers of science like to call nomological clusters or homeostatic clusters. And here I have in mind roughly the account of these notions that you'll find in the work of philosophers like Richard Boyd. That is to say, there's a strong law-like tendency for the members of the clusters to occur together. All right, so there's one conclusion, the clustering. You only get two clusters amongst a large number of possible clusters of answers you could get. Secondly, the response patterns, those clusters, correlate with transgression types. Each pattern is reliably evoked by a certain type of transgression. In particular, transgressions involving harm or justice or rights, and so I'll often say harm, justice, and rights, HJR, but in fact all the experiments focus on harm, that transgressions involving harm evoke the signature moral pattern. On the other hand, transgressions that don't involve harm, justice, or rights evoke the signature conventional pattern. Third, what I'll call the universality conclusion. The regularities I've just described are pancultural, and they emerge quite early in development. All right, so those are the generalizations along the empirical dimension. Now, what philosophical, as it were, conclusion can we draw from this? Well, the second conclusion maintains that these results support an important account of the nature of morality, namely that moral rules and indeed conventional rules are both psychological natural kinds. And indeed, the essential properties, and I'm from now on mostly going to focus on moral rules, the essential properties are just those specified in Turiel's definitions. Here's Turiel's definition: moral rules, objective prescriptive force, general not local, they involve someone who's been harmed, typically more serious. A little bit of a footnote here. I think it would be better to say, although one has to help out the folks in this tradition a bit because they're not as explicit as one would like, and that's fine. They're not professional philosophers. They're developmental psychologists for the most part. But I think the best way to put this is not that the rules have objective prescriptive force or that they do in fact hold generally and not locally, but rather that they are judged to have objective prescriptive force and hold generally not locally, making it clear that what we've got here is a psychological natural kind. Okay? It's a kind that falls into the category it does because of people's reactions. And also a sort of fine-tuning footnote, although this is really quite optional, I think it makes things a bit clearer, that I think a nice way to do this is to say that these three are the essential properties of moral rules, and that the fourth one can be treated as a nomological generalization, a generalization which specifies a law-like connection between moral rules and types of transgression, namely the things that have these three are only the harm or harm, justice, and rights related transgressions. Well, it seems to me that the conclusion that moral rules are a natural kind follows very plausibly from the putative facts that I've just laid out for you. There are moral rules according to these conclusions, or a class of rules which exhibit a homeostatic cluster of properties or a nomological cluster of properties. And furthermore, there's an important nomological generalization that members of the class share, namely that all members of the class involve harm or justice or rights. And of course, if that's right, there's an entirely parallel argument to be made that conventional rules, again, as defined by Turiel, are also a natural kind. Well, it's not surprising, obviously, that work in the moral conventional tradition, once it was discovered by philosophers a little bit late off the draw here. Turiel had been doing this stuff for 15 years or 20 years before philosophers became seriously influenced by it. But once they found it, it has profoundly influenced many of them, and also many psychologists who come from very different traditions in psychology. Why? Well, for a very simple reason. It's a profoundly important result if it's true. But alas, and this is what I'll be doing for much of the rest of the talk, it just ain't true. So what I now want to do is to tell you why, although morality may indeed be a natural kind, it isn't the natural kind that Turiel or that folks like Sean Nichols think it is. All right, so what I want to do now is to bring you a little bit more up close with some of the data. So as I said, there is a wealth of findings on the moral conventional task, but not everybody has been convinced by that first conclusion. And the dissenter, that's the generalizing the results conclusion, and not everybody has been convinced that those results generalize. And the dissenters have focused on this one, which, just to remind you, is the claim that if the transgression does not involve harm or justice or rights, then you'll get the signature conventional pattern. Okay? Well, that's where the focus of the literature until recently has been. And the dissenters, some of whom I'll mention in a bit, have claimed that many of them have been either anthropologists or psychologists interested in cultural psychology, folks like Rick Schwader and his students and postdocs. But many of them have maintained that there are many societies where transgressions which don't involve harm or justice or rights do not invoke the full so-called conventional response pattern. Rather, such transgressions evoke one or more of the signature moral response patterns. Well, there are a number of examples in the literature. Indeed, in a very nice article published almost a dozen years ago by, more than that maybe by now, by Gabinich, he lists at that time something like 20 publications assembling examples, and there have been more since then. But since time is short, I'll only mention 3. One of my favorites, and one early one, was done by Mordecai Nissen, who I believe was actually a student of Turiel, so in any event worked with Turiel at one point, learned the Turiel method and used it. So it's particularly nice because this study and the next one I'll tell you about from John Haidt used Turiel's techniques explicitly and exactly. Mordecai Nissen looked at children in Israel, and he looked at 3 different groups. 2 of those groups, namely secular urban children and children in Israeli kibbutzim, had just the same results that everybody was reporting. But the 3rd group were children in traditional Arab villages, and those children judged all the rules that they were presented with, or transgressions of which they were presented with, to be authority independent and generally applicable, despite the fact that, on the face of it at least, none of these involved violations of harm or involved harm, justice, and rights. So amongst the example were co-ed swimming and addressing the teacher in the school by his first name. And note, of course, these are central components of the moral response pattern. So if Turiel's right, we shouldn't be getting them there. Much more famously, John Haidt used a number of colorful transgressions. John is notorious for colorful transgressions, like eating the family dog, which has been run over by a car, right? So it's roadkill, treating the family dog as roadkill, cleaning out the toilet with an old tattered national flag that you happen to find around, and most notoriously that. And John has gotten himself in trouble a little bit. So in a popular online magazine, I think it's Slate, this appeared in a discussion. But moving right along, what John found was that in both the United States and in Brazil, low socioeconomic status participants judged these non-harm involving transgressions to be authority independent and generally applicable. And again, these are central components of the signature moral response pattern. Final study I want to tell you about is one done recently by Sean Nichols. And what Sean did is focus on another class of non-harm transgressions, namely transgressions of rules of etiquette. So he compared rules that prohibit disgusting behavior, like a dinner guest snorting into, I'm not quite sure what snorting is, so don't think it's something disgusting. Snorting and spitting, I guess, clearing your throat and spitting into your glass of water and then taking a drink during a dinner party, versus rules that prohibit non-disgusting behavior, like a dinner guest drinking tomato soup out of the bowl. What Sean found was that with children, the disgusting transgressions evoked the signature moral responses, or at least 3 of them. They were more serious, they were not authority dependent, and they generalized to other groups. The non-disgusting ones got the standard signature conventional pattern. So you've got moral pattern for disgusting ones, non-moral pattern for non-disgusting ones. Okay? With adults on the same material, or at least university students, on the same material, what he got was that the disgusting transgressions evoked two of the moral response patterns, more serious and not authority dependent, but they didn't generalize to other groups. Okay? And again, on the non-disgusting transgressions, Sean found that the signature conventional pattern was the one you got. Well, I'm inclined to think that Nichols' data adds to the mounting evidence against 2B there. That is to say, it shows that non-harm rights and justice conventional etiquette transgressions don't evoke the signature conventional response pattern. In addition to that, I think Nichols' result poses a particularly clear challenge to the idea that there is a clustering of judgments, a clustering of the criterion judgments. Why? Well, remember the idea here is that you're supposed to have a nomological cluster of these reactions, but in Nichols' work, the clusters come apart in two very different ways. One way for adults, one way for children, on exactly the same material. So taken together, I think these results pose a major challenge for the claims that I told you about earlier. Clustering, non-harm gives you the signature pattern, pan-cultural, okay? And I also think that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Part of the iceberg is in the literature. As I say, Gabinich 15 years ago, 12 years ago, cites 20 articles that offer counterexamples. But it's also the tip of the iceberg for a different reason, namely that the people using the moral conventional task until very, very recently have, for a variety of perfectly good reasons, only looked at a very narrow range of non-harm or non-harm rights and justice transgressions. And what I'm betting, and I'm actually trying to put my money where my mouth is, we're exploring this in some ongoing work, but what I'm betting is that if one looked at a wider range of non-harm justice and rights violations in the appropriate communities around the world, we'd find that that generalization, non-harm guys get signature patterns, would be massively disconfirmed. Like what? Well, nobody yet has looked at an example that John Haidt made famous in another context, namely sibling incest. I'm betting you don't get the convention. So harmless sibling, consensual adult sibling incest. Anybody wants to bet a good bottle of wine that you get the moral response, that you get the conventional response on those, just line up after break, and I'll take you on one by one. All right, something where there is some evidence, and we can talk about this in the discussion if you want. Indeed, Turiel and some of his followers have published some evidence on this. What about homosexuality? For example, for the 50% of Americans who in poll after poll claim that homosexuality is morally wrong, or taboo violations in traditional societies where taboos are taken seriously. For example, transgressions like reacting improperly to polluting acts, not being purified after being touched by a low-caste person. Again, I'm betting that you do not get the signature conventional pattern there, and we're working on it. Okay, but there's one generalization that hasn't been addressed yet. What about that one that I unhappily called C12A? Namely, just to remind you what it says is that transgressions involving harm evoke, or justice or rights, evoke the signature moral pattern. Well, in collaboration with Dan Kelly, who is a co-author on the remainder of this stuff, we did a literature search. And we could find in the literature not a single study that involved a harmful transgression where you didn't get the moral response pattern. Well, why is that? There are a number of possible explanations. One is that the generalization is true, that whenever there is a harmful transgression, you get the moral response pattern. But for three reasons at least, we're inclined to think that that's not the right explanation. The first is that even more so than on the conventional side and on the non-harm, justice, and right side, on the moral side or on the harm-involving side, the range of transgressions that has been studied in this huge literature, 80 to 100 studies, is remarkably narrow. And by the way, again, I don't attribute any bad motives to these folks. They started out as developmentalists. They had to use examples that could be used with young children, and they continued in that tradition. But what you find when you look at the literature is that all, literally so far as I can tell, with one exception that we did that I'll tell you about in a moment, all of the transgressions were what we've called schoolyard transgressions, things that is to say things you could see in a schoolyard and that a kid would understand, like pulling hair or pushing somebody off a swing. The most astounding example, very famous example, of course, that I know of this is James Blair's important work where he used schoolyard transgressions, pulling hair, pushing a kid off a swing. And his subjects in this experiment were incarcerated psychopathic murderers. One might think that a wider range of transgressions would be interesting to explore when you've got this exquisite and delightful class of participants who, by the way, aren't going anywhere, right? All right. So that's one reason, very narrow range of examples. Second, there are a bunch of philosophical views in the literature. Bernard Williams famously defended what he called the relativism of distance. Gil Harman has defended a very sophisticated version of moral relativism. They disagree on many things, but what they agree on is that there are many rules, many moral rules that people accept in their own lives and for their own culture, which they nonetheless do not generalize to other cultures or other historical periods, including rules that govern actions that are clearly harmful, like some of the examples from Williams or Harman, slavery, or corporal punishment, or treating women as chattel. And the third reason we had to be skeptical was the public discussion in the United States and elsewhere surrounding things like the prison camp, as it were, at Guantanamo Bay, where it certainly looks like, if you read the blogosphere or the public press, that a significant number of people don't consider rules prohibiting harmful treatment to be authority independent, although, of course, the Turiel view says they should. Well, to explore these, to look a little bit outside the box, to get out of the schoolyard transgressions, Dan Kelly and I joined forces with Dan Fessler, a brilliant young anthropologist at UCLA, and a couple of his students. And we ran a web-based experiment in which participants were asked about a number of transgressions that fit this unexplored category. So, for example, to explore whether rules prohibiting corporal punishment are judged to be authority independent, participants were presented with a pair of questions, and they were, of course, all counterbalanced and so on. So here's one. It's against the law for teachers to spank students. Ms. Williams is a third-grade teacher, and she knows about the law prohibiting spanking. She has also received clear instructions from her principal not to spank students. But when a boy in her class is very disruptive and repeatedly hits other children, she spanks him, and then all the participants were asked the same set of questions. Is it okay, yes or no? And on a scale from 0 to 9, how would you rate her behavior? Not where 0 is anchored by not bad at all, 9 is anchored by very bad. Well, this was followed, or sometimes preceded with appropriate changes in wording, by the following. Now suppose it's not against the law for teachers to spank students, and that Ms. Williams' principal had told her that she could spank students who misbehave if she wanted to. Same set of questions. Well, the results were, to put it mildly, dramatic. 8% said it's okay to spank in response to the first question, where it's prohibited by authority. 48% say it's okay to spank where it's not prohibited. And I do call your attention to that, which is a number you don't often see. Our n in this experiment was 1,645. We had, there may be lots wrong with our experiments, but the sample size isn't one of them. All right. Well, how about the question of generalization in space and time? Do people judge things that they take to be wrong now to also be wrong in the past? To explore that, here's one of the examples we used. 300 years ago, whipping was a common practice in most navies and on cargo ships. There were no laws against it, and almost everyone thought that whipping was an appropriate way to discipline sailors who disobey orders or were drunk on duty. Mr. Williams was an officer on a cargo ship 300 years ago. One night, while at sea, he found a sailor drunk at a time when the sailor should have been on watch. After the sailor sobered up, Williams punished the sailor by giving him 5 lashes with a whip. The other question, now each subject is presented with both questions, although only 2, by the way. So if you get this 2, you don't get the corporal punishment one. Had one additional scenario where we looked at the relativism of distance, that one, by the way, focusing on slavery, of all things. And we also had 5 additional scenarios where we looked at authority independence. And in each case, the data were entirely similar. And these, by the way, are now available, published in Mind and Language a few months ago. Well, we maintain that these findings pose a serious challenge to the one remaining generalization, which claims that harm norms evoke the signature moral response pattern. Indeed, what I want to suggest to you is that when we go beyond the narrow range of schoolyard transgressions that have been used in previous studies, many participants think that rules prohibiting harmful actions are neither authority independent nor general in scope. Well, where has this gotten us? What's the upshot of all of this? I think where it's gotten us is this. That, remember, C1 was an attempt to generalize the initial findings and say they hold quite generally over all transgressions involving harm or not involving harm and so on. It now looks to be the case a little bit by virtue of our new work, but in virtue of much of the other work in the literature as well. Every single member of the first set of conclusions, every single member looks to be false. Well, if that's right, then the second conclusion, which of course depended on the first, the argument from the argument to the conclusion that we've got a natural kind here, depended on the generalization claims. So it looks like we have no reason to believe that that conclusion is true either. So, conclusion, is morality a natural kind? Tentative conclusion I want to offer you, but this isn't quite the end yet. Tentative conclusion is that research involving the moral conventional task gives us no reason to think that the answer is yes. Indeed, I have a much stronger and darker view, which I might as well fess up to about the moral conventional task. I think the moral conventional task is an artifact. I don't think it measures anything interesting to measure, and indeed the reason for that is as soon as you get out of the schoolyard, the results fragment. Okay, but there is a postscript to the talk, and let me spend a few minutes on that, because whenever I give a talk on this topic, particularly focusing on these experiments, people ask, so what are you claiming? Are you claiming that there is no moral conventional distinction? And the answer here is not straightforward. The reason it's not straightforward is it's not entirely clear how that question is best understood. So let me do a few passes, but there are many more. Indeed, you may notice here we're up to slide 88. When it got to tickle 100, I thought, maybe I should stop. Okay, so we can discuss other interpretations in the discussion period. But if the question is, do moral rules and conventional rules constitute natural kinds? The answer is, first of all, that the research using the moral conventional task gives us no reason at all to think the answer is yes. But In the next lecture on, I guess, Friday, I'll sketch a theory about the psychological mechanisms underlying norms, which at least suggests that there is indeed a natural kind in this area, a natural kind of a certain kind of norm, although whether moral rule is an appropriate label for that particular natural kind, if indeed there is one there, is not a straightforward question. It depends to a significant extent on how the term moral rule is ordinarily used. That's not the only thing that determines it, but that's part of what would be involved in the dialectic from the model that I'll show you on Friday, assuming the model is correct, of course, to the claim that there's a natural kind in the area. And interestingly, at present, as we speak, almost nothing is known, at least in a systematic and empirically confirmed way, about how people use terms like moral rule, conventional rule, moral judgment, and so on. However, one of the former students in this august institution and I, Edouard Macheret and I, have a hypothesis. Our hypothesis is that we think the usage of the term moral rule, is governed in two ways. It's governed both by a prototype detailing typical reactions to transgressions. So if you're close enough to the prototype, that gets you 1 point in being a moral rule. But secondly, it's independently, and these are additive, we believe, independently governed by a set of exemplars of culturally familiar rules. Okay, so our picture roughly is, you first ask, do you know anything about the reaction to transgressions? Are they prototypical reactions like anger, punishment, and so on? If the answer is yes, you then ask, how close do they match? How close does a transgression match culturally available rules? Okay. Now, if we're right, the theory makes a prediction. It predicts that middle-class, liberal experimental participants will use the term, that is to say, will classify transgressions and rules in ways that are significantly different from, for example, observant Mormons, or conservative Muslims, or ultra-Orthodox Jews. If our hypothesis is correct, then I think, although I'd be happy to be illuminated on this, it's something we've just begun to think about seriously. If the hypothesis is correct, then I think there's an important sense in which the term moral rule is multiply ambiguous on one interpretation of multiple ambiguity. And there's also an important sense in which there may be no single concept of moral rule, but rather a wide family of them. If that's right, then the traditional project of providing a definition of morality, the project which aims at, as that literature that Alasdair MacIntyre was talking about in the first slide, that linguistic analysis or conceptual analysis literature, that project aims to capture ordinary usage. Well, if the hypothesis that Macheret and I are exploring is right, then I think that entire project, which, remember, MacIntyre tells us was the central project in moral theory at the time, has to be radically reconceived. Well, is our hypothesis right? The answer is that with a bit of luck, I'll be able to offer you some data on my next trip to Paris. And with that, I'll stop.